The following webinar was recorded as part of the original implementation of IWISH and has been made available for informational purposes only. Some portions of the original recording have been cut to ensure participants' privacy. References to the Lewin Group, implementation team, site liaisons, PHL, Google Drive, and some forms are not applicable to the demonstration extension effective October 1st, 2020. Terms and conditions of grantee's cooperative agreement supersede any information presented here. Please see the IWISH Operations Manual for the most up-to-date implementation information.
The following webinar was recorded as part of the original implementation of IWISH and has been made available for informational purposes only. Some portions of the original recording have been cut to ensure participants' privacy. References to the Lewin Group, implementation team, site liaisons, PHL, Google Drive, and some forms are not applicable to the demonstration extension effective October 1st, 2020. Terms and conditions of grantee's cooperative agreement supersede any information presented here. Please see the IWISH Operations Manual for the most up-to-date implementation information.
Thank you so much for joining us for engaging with residents, strategies, and considerations for building relationships and supporting behavior change. Next slide. So as you listen to all the awesome information that Walter and Chris will be sharing with you, there'll be a lot of content, some photos, some diagrams that you'll see. I want to help you focus your attention on two questions so that way you can kind of filter and process the information. The first one is, which strategies will you practice in the next 2 weeks to become more comfortable when communicating with older adults? And then, what will you do to ensure your interactions are person-centered? Now, if you're already practicing person-centered approach, then we want you to consider what you already do to make interactions person-centered and what could strengthen that. Again, you're going to be hearing a lot of information, and it may seem overwhelming, but the best way to help you focus on what to take away and put into action is focusing on these two questions: what strategies you want to practice, and how will you ensure that your interactions are person-centered. Next slide.
Hello.
Hi, Christy.
Hello.
Great. We got you back.
Great. Thank you. Whoever fixed that, that's wonderful. Hi, everyone. I'm going to present to you just a case study for you to keep in mind. This is a client that is part of IWISH, and I want you to keep this person in mind as Walter goes through the materials after me. This is AB. AB is a 68-year-old man. He lives in the affordable housing site in Vermont. He has a history of alcoholism, cirrhosis, hypertension, and multiple falls. He is a smoker. You can see how much he smokes per day. He is in the music industry. He works as a DJ. He has two sons. One lives in Arizona, and one lives locally. The son that lives locally is within a 20-minute drive to his apartment. He's been divorced for over 20 years. And he enrolled in IWISH due to his frequent falling, a decline in health, and he also needed to quit smoking. The housing site that he lived in, at the time, they were going smoke-free, so he was seeking assistance. And I will turn it over to Walter.
Hello, can you hear me? I don't know.
Yeah,
I think if everyone is on mute, you probably wouldn't be able to respond. Okay, but good. Somebody did respond. Hi, everyone. I literally just called in. We were having some technical difficulties. So I think I'm on to my section, and someone else is advancing the slides. Is that right?
Correct.
If so, next slide, please. I just want you to know that I'm coming at everything from sort of a social work, psychosocial perspective, with a good deal of sort of hospital administrative background as well. So I hope to bring both of those perspectives in. All right, so without further ado, I know we have a tight agenda. I'm going to dive right in, but also say that I think we're hearing some other conversations in the background. So if you could, mute yourself, please. All right. So next slide, please. Okay, so what are we even really doing here? So I think the key to this project from my humble perspective is in the relationships. That's I think what's going to make or break this really interesting project, in that for any of you that have worked in the milieu, that have directly interacted with other clients, you know how important it is that the how of what we're doing. You know, there are plenty of pathways out there, plenty of workflows which tell you do this thing first, do the next thing next, and that's fine. Those are important to have, but also the way that we really approach any sort of project is really what trumps everything. So today is very much a primer on that how. We're going to dive into a lot more detail when we see each other in person. But let's basically start with this building relationship side of things. So this is really the key aspect of our role, and it's to identify goals related to resident health and well-being and providing supports and encouragements to get there. So pretty straightforward. What are your goals? How can we help you get there? But to do this, we need to understand something that I bet everyone always thinks they understand, except we're not very good at it. You know, we want to understand, how do people actually make change? If there was a recent change that any of you made on the phone, so take a second to just think about that. It could be anything, new haircut, you decided to go see movies more, whatever it is. Just think, what was it that made you go from, yeah, I'm not sure, to, yeah, I'm going to do it now? Just sort of reflect on that. Then and also reflect on, were relationships involved in any supportive way? I bet, I'm sorry, I'm still hearing some talking in the background, but that's fine. So I bet if as you're reflecting on your change, you'll probably think of 1, 2, 3 or more people that were really instrumental to moving things along, as an encouragement, as a support, as a sounding board, etc. So just really know that relationships are critical to making change happen. And you're that person. You're the folks that are going to be having the relationships. So you're really the linchpin to everything. Next slide, please. All right, so closing up this very short initial section. So when do people make change? The next few bullets probably go without saying, but of course we make change when we are voluntarily interested or concerned about the need. That's the easy part. So I want to do it, let's go for it. But also sometimes we become convinced that change is in our best interest. So now we're getting to sort of the gray area of making that actually happen, the convincing. And then also when there's a plan of action in front of us and that we're able to act on this plan and have this plan sustain the change. So all too often we interact with other disciplines, especially in the medical field, where the plan is sort of handed to you, and in a pretty straightforward way, you're told what to do. It's like, oh, hey, you want to be healthy? No problem. Eat these fruits and vegetables, follow the food pyramid, exercise, you're going to be well on your way. Well, of course, we know that doesn't work, and there needs to be a little more. Sorry, still there's more talking. So, of course, we know that's not going to work. We need to know the context of the lives of the individuals that we have around us, and that context is really going to make or break our ability to follow through on the change. So in very many ways, your job as you're interacting with the residents is to understand the concept, the context, the entire landscape of where the person is coming from, because then you can get to this really, really critical thing called change talk. In change talk, for any of you that are already trained in motivational interviewing, and if not, we're going to get into a lot more of it today and in person, but change talk is really what you want to get to. It's communication from the client's perspective that indicates, yeah, I want to move in that direction, in whatever the direction of the positive change is. So that's our goal. That's our setup for now. Next slide, please. And I think now we're going to have a chance to reflect as a group.
Thank you, Walter. So in the chat box, we want to hear from you. As we said, we want this to be a dynamic presentation and we want it to be interactive. Go in and type in a time you had to make a change, and then also share how did you feel. Take a moment and tell us the time you had to make a change, and then also share how it made you feel, how it made you feel. So Jen shared, Mindy shared when she moved her mother-in-law into home due to health reasons, and it made her feel excited to help.
Okay, and then you can't turn this.
Renee shared when she moved out of an apartment and in with the family for a while, it was stressful. She felt stressed.
Okay, so you're in.
Amelia shared, I had to move to another city, and it made her feel good. And Brenda shared, decided to go on a weight management program because of my own health reasons. I was excited, nervous, overwhelmed, afraid of failure. Thank you all so much for sharing. Keep sharing into the chat box. We're going to keep moving forward with our presentation. So back to you, Walter.
Thank you. Those are really great examples. Those are real-world examples, and I love the weight management program. I think every single example spoke to sort of the reality of life that we all experience. Next slide, please. But I love that for any sort of change, there's not a single reaction that we have. There are many, and sometimes there are conflicting emotions. And that really speaks to something very important we'll get to later as well, which is that we have a lot within us that wants the change, and then there's a lot of ambivalence as well. And in order for us to really help change to happen, we need to be coming at our conversations from a person-centered perspective. That framework will absolutely make the difference between this project succeeding and not. So what is person-centered thinking? It's a certain set of beliefs, of course, and the central defining characteristic is that we need to believe that people are the experts in their own lives. Sometimes that may feel counterintuitive, particularly if we're faced with someone who clearly has maybe made some less than stellar choices in their lives, and what we see are sometimes the after effect of that choice. And maybe that then brings up this desire to say, no, they've kind of had a go at it. They didn't do very well, so why don't we tell them what to do? Well, that just doesn't work very well. And so we need to truly believe that people are the experts in their lives, that they have the right to be the experts in their lives. And our role is to embody every single interaction we have with our residents with that feeling, because then there's a certain level of trust that gets created, the relationship becomes stronger, and then we can effectuate change. If we dismiss individuals as not knowing what's good for them, so to speak, that sort of dooms us to failure from the get-go. For many people, this way of thinking is supporting them in realizing the life they desire requires skilled planning, facilitation, and services and supports that are responsive to their issues. So that's a key statement right there too. It's not enough to know that someone is the expert in their own lives, but also that there are some other additional resources that are necessary for change to happen. Okay, next we move on to the process. So the planning process starts with, I'm sorry, we're still on the previous slide, just on the second part of the slide, thank you. So we need to start with person-identified goals, desires, preferences. These will really guide care plan development. They have to. If the care plan doesn't speak to you as an individual and you can't point to some things in that plan that you can take ownership for that really resonate with you, it's going to fall apart. So this is where an interesting dichotomy comes into play, this whole important to versus important for concept. So something may be important to a client. And to a client, it may be important that they get to smoke every day or drink every day. That could be important to them. But then there's something that may be important for them, important for their health outcomes, for example, et cetera. And those two things are not necessarily always going to be aligned. In fact, they will often not be aligned. So keeping that in mind is important in person-centered planning. So the plans that we make that describe the preferences and interests that make up a desired life and the supports needed to achieve it. So once we start with the operating set of beliefs, this is our person-centered thinking, people are experts in their lives, then when we can move on to planning, where we're considering what's important to someone, for someone, and then the plan is going to be the key. That's what we're going to follow as we go through the intervention. And the practice of this really integrates the principles of person-centered thinking and planning in all systems. And whether we're talking about frontline providers, management, IT, policy staff, so everyone on this call, and dozens of people, if not hundreds across the country who are not on the call, who are in supportive positions, we all must share this perspective. Next slide, please. All right, so the key principles for engaging with residents, there are really 4 of them. So the person-centeredness we talked about, strengths-based approach, realistic expectations, and cultural humility. And so when we're talking about person-centeredness, we're focusing on the goals and desires of the residents, as I just discussed. The strengths-based approach, for anyone with maybe a social work, psychosocial background, is something that was really instrumental to our education. However, it's often easy to talk about, but not all that easy to muster in practice, this strength-based approach. A lot of clients that we interface with at Rush Urban Medical Center, a lot of things are sort of falling apart. It's not always easy to find something really positive to focus on, or strengths, when sometimes you're looking at something, excuse the term, that's more of a train wreck, is how sometimes we hear people talk. So it's important to focus on strengths, because in any environment, in any individual, there are absolutely strengths there to be leveraged. And this can't be a Pollyannish sort of talking out of both sides of your mouth kind of thing. This must be a genuine belief and a genuine understanding of certain strengths, realizing there will also be challenges as well, but focusing on those strengths as we're developing the relationships with residents. So remember, these are principles for engaging. If you're engaging someone, you probably don't want to start off by saying, hey, you really might want to think about your diet. You might want to start off by saying, hey, it looks like you have all these really interesting hobbies of this really great background, something like that. You want to set realistic expectations with the residents and yourself and the team, and really understanding what the role of this program has in the resident's life. Because for us, for everyone in this call, certainly, I very much hope this is an important project. It's an important program. That's a lot of potential. For residents, this may be really, at first, just a blip on the radar. They're like, oh, all right, well, I have my whole life. I'm doing my thing, and today they're telling me about this other program. I've heard something like this 30 times before. So how do we realistically present this program in a way where the expectations won't overwhelm? It'll take a little bit for realistic buy-in from the residents, and the engagement is what's going to make the difference with that. And finally, with the slide, practicing cultural humility, which I will get at just a couple of slides. All right, next slide, please. All right, cultural competence and humility. I bet everyone on this call has heard this said so many times. I can even feel some eye rolls from where I am. And then I think that's because sometimes cultural competence and humility do not really get presented in a way that really represents the spirit of it well. So on the competence side of things, we all, of course, should strive to be educated in our clients' cultures. In some ways, that makes sense. If I'm working in a neighborhood, let's say, where there's a lot of Hispanic, Latino individuals, well, it'd probably be a good idea, even if I don't belong to that race or ethnicity, that I learn a little bit about it. At the same time, the humility side of things, to me, sort of balances out the idea that we can actually truly ever be competent in any culture other than our own. I think we can strive to learn, and that willingness is really important, the willingness to learn. But we also have to have humility for the individualized expression of that culture that we see in front of us. And there's a really big difference between looking at someone in front of you and say, oh, this is a Hispanic male, versus thinking of that individual as a person. This is Mr. Rodriguez. He may or may not enjoy the things that I learned about Latino Hispanic culture. He may or may not dislike these other things. So you're coming in with a set of knowledge, with some knowledge there, but you also need to be willing to suspend what you know or what you think you know based on the generalizations of that culture. It's really, really important, and especially important when it comes to engagement, because if someone is listening to you, especially if you don't share their cultural background, and you try to come off as kind of understanding and knowing, that's going to fall flat. You really are going to lose people. You know, you'll get a lot of, oh, you think you know me kind of responses. No one wants to be put in a box. So yes, we need to have cultural competence, but we also need to be open to somebody's personal culture. What have they determined is their expression of their culture? Next slide, please. So before we reflect on this, I want to close off this section by talking about the ecological systems theory. Urie Bronfenbrenner didn't even come from social work, and yet somehow it has inserted itself into social work. But this is a framework that really should be shared by anyone dealing with people in any sort of service capacity, in my opinion. And the idea here is very simple. We don't exist in a vacuum. Nobody on this call, certainly not myself, we have a lot of systems revolving around us. So you have the person in the middle, that's you, that's your weight, your age, your diagnoses, your medications, your likes, your dislikes, all of that is in the middle. Around you is a microsystem. The microsystem really is as simple as any system, or really entity, individual, you can think about it that way, anything that you interact with directly. This could be your family, school, peers, religious institutions, your workplace, neighborhood. Anyone that you have a direct interaction with, that's part of your microsystem. So if you just for a second think about your microsystem, you could probably think of dozens, if not hundreds of people or places that comprise your microsystem. But interestingly, and this is very real world, a lot of members of your microsystem interact within themselves as well. So your family might interact with your neighborhood or your religious organization, etc. So this adds an interesting layer of complexity. So my microsystems have their own microsystems that they share. And then all of those certainly exist within this larger exosystem. So these are economic, political, educational, governmental components, which of course are going to impact everything, especially when we talk about social determinants of health and things like that. And particularly in some of the areas that are part of this project, that becomes very, very important. So you can have one housing location in a certain area, and then another area, maybe even similar demographic composition, but the exosystem within which that particular housing building, within which that building exists, may be really radically different. And so we have to be realistic and very on the ground with respect to our relationship. So there's a macro system that overarches everything. These are overarching beliefs and values that the chrono system tells us really evolve over time. All of these things are in constant flux. So is this really a perspective that you need to carry with you at every moment of the day? Of course not. It really becomes overwhelming quickly. But what I love once in a while to just reflect on my own as I think about life, the individuals in my life, just to know that we just see just the tiniest tip of the iceberg whenever we talk to anyone. All of us really carry this whole other world within themselves. So when it comes to engagement, which is what we're talking about right now, realizing that our one-on-one interaction with someone is really a privilege. We get to step into their microsystem and become part of that person's world. And the more meaningfully we can do this, the more impact we're going to have. All right, so for the next slide, let's take about 30 minutes. No need to type anything out yet. Not minutes, seconds. Minutes would be great, but let's take 30 seconds or so just to think about that. Think about yourself. Think about your micro-mesosystems. Think about person-centeredness, etc. And then we'll switch the slide in about 20 seconds from now, and we'll ask you to, well, there's going to be a little bit of a poll and some more interaction. So I'm going to stop talking for another 15, 20 seconds. All right, I think that's probably good. We can move on to the next slide. Plenty of time to reflect on the important things in life. Plenty.
Thank you so much, Walter. We're now going to take a quick poll. You're going to enter your response into the chat. Let us know by typing yes or no if you have experience using person-centered approaches in your work. Type yes or no to answer the question, do you have experience using person-centered approaches in your work? We have lots of yeses. That's great.
It would be a lot more fun if there were a few no's, but it's okay. There you go.
Lots of yeses. We're going to keep moving forward. Walter, I'm going to turn it back to you. Feel free to keep responding in the chat box, yes or no.
So I'm so glad that we're seeing so many yeses. And I'll just sort of honestly comment on myself, which is to say that I certainly take pride in the fact that I think I'm person-centered almost all the time. But you know what? I think we all drop the ball sometimes. And sometimes we really bring a lot of ourselves into the equation, our own beliefs, and what we think is common sense where it may not be for someone else. So a lot of this project is about trying to balance that. You're not going to be able to delete yourself out of the equation for sure, but keeping in mind that we need to keep coming back to things being person-centered. And I was at Rush for about 10 years, but for about 4 or 5 before that, I was in the community dealing with mental illness, substance abuse, and I got to tell you, especially when dealing with substance abuse, it's very tough to really hold strong with that person-centered approach. Sometimes you just think you know better, and you just really want to get in there and make some change happen, but it's not that easy. And so next slide, please. I think what we're talking about here is behavior change. That's the overarching goal here. And keep going, next slide. Because we've engaged with our residents, we have a decent relationship, but now we need to make actual change happen. So I'm sure very many of you have heard of the stages of change. Stages of change is really sort of a fundamental concept. Of course, well, maybe not of course, but it comes from substance abuse. And while it's very appropriate to substance abuse, stages of change can be, as a framework, can be applied to literally any change that you're going through. And I bet if you think about some of those changes you were thinking about earlier, you can remember times when you kind of wanted to do it, or maybe you were in denial. Someone told you it's not just a river in Egypt, and then you went into some sort of an action plan. So those things are something that we all go through. But to really sort of go through this sequentially, the stages of change are as follows. There's pre-contemplation. Sometimes this is called denial, but basically, I'm not a big fan of the term. But the essential concept there is you don't really acknowledge that there's an issue there yet. Maybe you prefer not to think about it, but others seem to notice, but you're not really on board. And then at some point, something happens. You're like, all right, okay, there's something going on here, and I can no longer ignore it. I need to turn in that direction and look at it. And that's really good. So ambivalence in this stage is absolutely common. In fact, it's the defining feature of contemplation. You're thinking about, you're just contemplating something. You're not there yet, you're contemplating. Once you're done with contemplating, you can then move on to preparing. All right, yes, I need to lose weight. Yes, I need to exercise more. Yes, I need to do whatever it is that you want to do, but now I'm ready to make this change. So I'm going to prepare for it. Maybe research what I should do, etc. Then you do this thing, whatever it is that you've come up with. That's the action phase, and that's where the change of the behavior happens. And then, of course, the most difficult stage of it all, which is the maintenance stage. Sometimes it's easy to get to a certain place if you work hard enough, but it's when it's no longer this tantalizing goal, when you've achieved it, it's all too easy to then say, that wasn't so bad, I can come back to it again. And then you go back to your previous bad habits, and that just happens again and again, which is why relapse is actually another stage of change. It's so common to get somewhere and then to go right back. There's another interesting visual I've seen of the stages of change cycle when it's literally shown as a cycle. So everything goes in this clockwise fashion from pre-contemplation to relapse, except sort of superimposed on this cycle is a spiral. Because the notion is every time you relapse and you come back to pre-contemplation, it's going to be a different pre-contemplation, and hopefully you're growing. And so it'll take a few times to relapse, but it won't be the same relapse, and then there's sort of hope for growth. So what does that mean for us with this project? It means that every single person that you're talking to are going to be in a different stage of change with respect to their goals. And for some goals, they may be in action. For other goals, they may be in contemplation. And with some other goals, they may be in relapse. And it's important to keep that in mind because it doesn't make any sense to talk to someone who is in the pre-contemplation phase in the same way that you're talking to someone who's trying to maintain their successes. That's a lot to balance. And so this is where person-centeredness comes into play. All right, next slide, please. So in order for us to make behavioral change happen, we're going back to what I mentioned a few slides ago about making change talk happen. So all of us, this goes without saying, although I said it a few times, we certainly have this internal dialogue sometimes where there's a lot of statements that we can make that favor the change. So for example, I know I need to do something about my drinking, but at the same time, there's something else you can say about that exact same thing that could be sustained talk. Sustained talk is any talk that sort of sustains the current path of action, so you're not changing. So yeah, maybe I need to do something about my drinking, but it really doesn't affect anyone else, and I like to wind down at the end of the night with a glass of wine. That's really not hurting anyone. Why can't I do that? And I think you can easily see how both of those statements can really coexist, sometimes pretty comfortably in the same person's head, really with the end result, the net result being that you're still staying where you are. So sustained talk really tends to win over 9 times out of 10. Next slide, please. So before we close off this little section on behavioral change, it's important to reflect that, that our thoughts, things like our actions, so the conversations that we have, the thoughts that we have, really interact with our behaviors and really our physical response too. So the graphic that you're seeing, some of you may recognize it, comes from cognitive behavioral therapy. And the idea there is very simple, and I think intuitive. It makes a lot of intuitive sense, which is to say that our thoughts influence our behaviors and our feelings and the physical responses. So just think about your commute this morning, if you had a commute, or what's happening to you right now. So you may be listening to my voice and thinking something. And that thought may be, oh, I know this stuff. I can't believe I have to listen to this thing. And maybe that's impacting some feelings. And so you're starting to feel some frustration or agitation, which is going to, of course, impact your behavior too. Maybe you tend to zone out a little, look out the window if you have a window or something like that. Look down on your phone. If you're on your phone right now, just try to not be on your phone. It's so hard. We're so connected to these devices. All of these things are they're interrelated. And there's a physical response too. And so in the sense that sometimes when we're excited, our heart rate goes up. We become a little more just aware, awake, present. All these things are interacting together. And very, very easy to see how the tide can swing in the other direction too, where your thought may well be, all right, so this is interesting. I'm glad that this is a project that I'm involved in. It's an interesting project. We have an opportunity to impact hundreds and hundreds of people and potentially then scale up to thousands more. So this could bring up feelings of well-being and satisfaction and excitement. Your behavior could be one of maybe jotting down a few notes or paying attention a little bit more to the exercises in between the sections. And your physical response could be one that's a little bit more awakened. You're more present. You're more engaged. And that's kind of a neat sort of framework to keep in mind to me, because I feel that regardless of where you enter, and I started both of those examples with thoughts, but everything can start with behaviors and feelings. We have an opportunity, each of us, to make changes within ourselves, as do our clients. And understanding that there's so many other elements that make change happen, that includes thoughts, behaviors, and feelings, and the physical response is helpful. I think it's helpful particularly when you're sitting across from someone and you maybe are observing something. You might be observing a behavior or a physical response from them, which can then lead to a conversation about that thing, so you can hopefully right the ship, so to speak. So let's go to the next slide and take a minute, an actual minute this time, to reflect on what I was just talking about. So I'll stop. All right, and I think that's good. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Great. So when we're talking about building relationships and supporting change, just a quick reminder from what was mentioned in one of the early slides, we really make change when we're voluntarily interested, when there's change talk involved, when clients become convinced that change is in their best interest. That's really when you want to do things, and when there's a plan of action that we can follow to get to the change to happen and to sustain it. And then we're trying to elicit change talk by building relationships. So we're engaging with residents so that there's a trust there, and we're having a guided conversation about their goals. So there's going to be a quick chat interaction, and we're going to dive into that last part here about the guided conversation. So next slide, please.
Thank you, Walter. So as Walter mentioned, we want to dive a little bit deeper, and so we want to hear from you. What ideas do you have to elicit change talk? What strategies have you all used in your practice thus far? Share with us any ideas that you have to elicit change talk. Denise says, providing self-assessment survey to begin conversations, written surveys to begin conversations. From Sylvia, discussing the long-term effects without change. Karina, open-ended questions and listening to residents speak without interruptions. Lisa J says, asking, what have you done in the past that worked with this issue? Fatima says, initially, let the resident know how much I care for them as a person and that I'm concerned for their health and want them to live a long, happy life. I like that. You all are very caring people. Renee provides facts. What did you say, Walter?
I just said I love that too. Sorry, keep going.
I know, it's fine. I really, the responses show that you all care about your residents, and I think that's awesome. Renee, provide facts as to why the resident may want to consider change. Charnel, getting the resident to trust you by actively listening to them. Asking very broad questions and then listening without interruption. Oh, I like this. Christina says, ask the resident what's most important to them and listen to them. And we have several other responses coming in. Walter, did you want to comment real quick before we move on?
No, I mean, sure. I think maybe I need to, but I'm sitting here smiling because that's my behavioral response, and my emotional response is one of well-being. This is really wonderful, and I think it shows that you're coming from such a kind place, and in some ways, that's what it comes down to for me. Just being a good person and not feeling like you're just doing a job. In the social services, we're often so inundated with just caseloads. There's a lot of caseloads. There's a lot of throughput. People easily become numbers instead of people. And yet, it's a privilege to be next to someone, one-on-one, to share in their lives. It's such an amazing experience that if you think about it, such a huge percentage of the population never gets to experience that. And it's an amazing opportunity for us to be the human beings that we want to do. I'm also a little bit disturbed by whatever's happening with this little picture, the arms. Now I feel like there were arrows shot through the arms. I don't know. I think he or she is lifting up the arms quickly, and that's supposed to be the movement of the wind, but it's a little strange to me at this point. Anyway, sorry, let's move on. Next slide, please. Thank you for all those wonderful responses. So when it comes to the skills we need to support change, so many of the things that you just were commenting on in chat really are just these are the skills that we're talking about. And they're very much in the spirit of motivational interviewing, which we're going to focus on today. Acceptance and commitment therapy is also very helpful. That's a mindfulness-based technique that we won't go into today. Cognitive behavioral therapy we briefly touched on, and the social cognitive theory. So again, today, mostly MI. So let's move on. Next slide, please. And the slide after. So this is just a primer, of course. So for those of you that are not familiar with motivational interviewing, it's really just a collaborative conversation style where the idea here is everyone is motivated. And if you look around your life, you will know that that's true. Everyone is absolutely motivated because they exist and they're doing something. So they're clearly motivated to do the thing that they're doing. That thing may be to stay at home, pop open a glass of champagne or something, or wine, and watch some Netflix. You could be motivated to do that. It may not be the thing that someone else would like for you to be motivated for, but we're motivated. So it's a collaborative conversation style to strengthen the person's own motivation and commitment to change, because we may also have some motivation in a more positive direction, but we may need some help to get there. And it's empirically supported, which is important to mention here. There's a lot of research behind this. So it's an empirically supported way of being that's empathic, open, non-judgmental, and collaborative. That's next slide, please. So it's a guided conversation. So it's somewhere between actively directing and passively following along. So we're neither telling someone what to do, nor are we just listening and nodding. We're trying to strategically guide the conversation so we can evoke the positive goals we hope are there and get change talk. So there's a mix there of spirit and process, absolutely. Next slide, please. So the spirit has 4 components, pretty straightforward, but really worth mentioning: compassion, partnership, acceptance, and evocation. Compassion is, of course, there's that person-centered thing, empathy, understanding where the person is coming from. Partnership is important in that we're sort of in it together. Remember, the client is an expert in their own lives, so we can partner with them, but we certainly are not going to present ourselves as being the expert. Acceptance is really critical. This comes back to stages of change and being person-centered. We're meeting the person where they are right now. We accept them as a human being that deserves to be the way they are, and so we're meeting them there. And then we're going to take off down a certain road together. And that road is paved, if you will, with evocation. So we're evoking positive goals in change talk. Next slide, please. And if this seems a little fast, we absolutely will dive into a lot more detail during our in-person sections. So you can ask yourself, how does this resonate with you? Why would I want to help others? Try to remember, why did you get into this profession? What notions do I have about helping? How can I relate to those that I'm helping? Next slide, please. All right, so let's take a minute just to reflect on that. And in the interest of time, maybe less than a minute, but let's take a little bit to reflect on it. And then I will move on. Okay, so the process of MI really has 4 components. Don't think of these as sequential. You're very much sort of may always be doing all 4 at the same time. All right, so we do have 10 minutes left. When should I wrap up? Sorry, I just want to make sure that I'm not running over time. I'm so sorry if I'm running over.
No, you can keep going. I'll let you know if we have to speed up a little bit more. So you can
All
go
right,
through this in my process.
Thank you. Give me like a minute heads up or something like that. Thank you. So there are four processes. We're engaging. We talked a lot about engagement, and it has to be authentic. We really need to get together with someone. We're focusing. As you're going through the interviews that you'll be going through, you will very easily see that there are so many things happening in someone's life. And there could be so many different goals, but we really need to focus, because if we try to chase too many rabbits, we're just going to lose all of them. We really need to focus, and that's very, very important. We're evoking constantly, so we're evoking that change talk, trying to get people to be more confident in where they're going, and planning. So how are we going to get there? And again, these happen together very frequently. You can go back to engaging, you can refocus, constantly evoking. But those are the four key processes of motivational interviewing. Next slide, please. And I'll close off by talking about the key motivational interview technique, which is OARS. There are several techniques. We'll dive into a few others. But to me, if you learn nothing else from this entire project, OARS would be great in terms of interacting with your clients, but also with anyone in your life. And based on your chat responses earlier, I can see many of you are probably well-grounded in this already. But I find this a great way to interact with my coworkers, my family, my children especially. It's just one of those things that really yields results in sort of in a humanistic way, if you will. So there are four components: open-ended questions, affirmative statements, reflective listening, and summary statements. And let's dive into those one at a time. Next slide, please. Open-ended questions, pretty straightforward. Just don't ask a question that you can answer with a yes or no. The reason for that, I think, is also straightforward in that if you ask a question that's yes or no, you're going to get a yes or no answer, of course. So the problem with the yes or no answer is that you get no nuances, and also you're often likely going to get a no. And what I mean by that is if you're asking someone about their challenges and you say something like, do you understand your medications? They might say, or do you have any problems with your medications? They might say no. It's a very closed-ended question. People don't want to be burdened. They don't want to sort of appear like they're not on top of something. Very often there's just a tendency to do that, as opposed to asking someone, can you tell me about your medications? Which is very different, because now you're asking for them to actually talk to you. And if they're stumbling, if they seem like they don't know what their medications are, etc., without asking yes or no question, you've answered the question of do they understand their medications or not. And along the way, you've learned some specific information about what they're having trouble with. So things like, what brings you here today? How has this issue affected your day-to-day life? Tell me more about your concern, etc., etc. I just love that each one of those keeps the conversation going and gives you more information. And I love this WAIT acronym. I love it. A little ironic that I'm talking about that now, but WAIT is, why am I talking? There's this really powerful human mechanism that if there's a silence, you know, that whole awkward silence thing, we want to fill it. We just want to keep talking. And a lot of times the people that we're speaking to, especially if you're a provider for them, they may yield the floor to you, if you will. And so it seems like there's a silence. So you as a provider are diving in and talking more. Next thing you know, you're talking, but the other person hasn't really said very much. So silence is a very powerful tool. And so when you're asking open-ended questions, stopping and listening and waiting for the other person to come meet you is really important. Next slide. We'll get into affirmations a lot in the in-person training, but essentially this is another way of saying that you're being the cheerleader for the person in front of you. But there's a little bit of a trick to this. A lot of times you can praise people. Good job, you know, I'm so proud of you, or something like that. And at first that feels like such a nice thing to say. Why wouldn't you say that? But it seems that one of the challenges that develops as a result is there's this dependency dynamic where people start approaching change from the perspective of eliciting praise from you, this person they have at this point already some sort of a good relationship with, but you want them to do things for them. So notice the two examples at the bottom are a little more neutral. thanks for coming in today. You stuck with it even though it didn't go as planned. It's a you statement, not an I statement. Not, I'm proud with you for sticking with it, but you stuck with it. It's an actually pretty important distinction. Next slide, please. So the next slide is about reflections, which are the most important part of motivational interviewing. Reflections is a fundamental skill which essentially keeps the conversation moving. Reflecting is often portrayed, when you watch movies about shrinks and they say things like, so what I'm hearing you say is, or that's a reflection right there, or it sounds like, that's a reflection. And there are many different types of reflections, some very simple reflections where perhaps you're just literally repeating a part of what somebody just told you, or just gently, slightly rephrasing it. Or there are complex reflections where you may be reflecting emotional content. So somebody may be speaking about something, but they seem agitated. So rather than commenting on the content of what they said, you comment on the emotions by saying it sounds like you're a little bit agitated or something like that. And that sometimes makes people feel more heard than you just reflecting on the actual content. So reflections create momentum for the conversation. They keep the person talking, exploring, and it allows people to hear again the thoughts and the feelings they're saying. So you are sort of letting the client hear back what they were telling you and sort of reflect on it a little bit as well. That could be a pretty powerful dynamic. Next slide, please. And we're ending with summarizing. In many ways, summarizing is just a longer reflection. You're taking bigger chunks of what happened, and you try to summarize it back. There are three main reasons for summary. You could collect information, link previous part of the conversation to the current one, or you can use it to transition to another topic. And I think at this point, I'm finally going to wait, ask myself, why am I talking, and stop completely, and hand it off to you guys.
Thank you, Walter. Yes, we're going to give Walter a quick break, and we want to briefly, we're going to talk briefly into this group chat. Tell us what aspect of motivational interviewing resonates with you. Is it the open-ended responses? Is it the affirming? Is it the reflecting, or is it the summarizing? So which technique of motivational interviewing best resonates with you? We have reflecting, affirming and reflecting are popping up so far as the top two. Reflecting, people really, really like reflecting. Thank you all for responding to the chat. I'm so excited to see you all participating in this presentation. Walter, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Is it really me? I thought someone else was taking over at this point. I can certainly take us home, especially now that we have 2 minutes left.
I thought it's Christy. Sorry, I meant Christy. Christy, back to you.
Okay.
Christy's going to wrap us up, putting it all
Christy,
together.
I'm so sure I gave you like no time left. I'm so sorry. I tried to go fast.
Do we still have Christy? Oh, she may be on mute. Walter, do you mind wrapping us up? I think Christy may be muted at this point.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And let's fly through the next few slides, and don't worry about us missing too much right now. The whole idea for today is to plant a lot of seeds and then to say it again and again a few times, and that may feel redundant, but in fact, it's a really good reinforcer of the process. So let's just kind of dive through the next one. Next slide, please. So I think what the case study should have highlighted, and again, I'm sorry, I was only able to dive in a little late, is the social cognitive theory approach of reinforcement where the person is coming from, and self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is really, really key. Having person-centered goals, so goals that really resonate with the person, and an action plan. All of those things have to really work together. Next slide. So these are the themes that have been coming up over and over again this time around, and I'm going to repeat them again, even though, again, it may sound redundant, but this should be such second nature to all of us by the time we finish. We're talking about person-centeredness, having a strength-based approach, leveraging what the person is able to do. We have to set realistic expectations while having cultural humility and the personal culture. Remember, it's not cultural competency as much as it is humility, is the way that I like to see it. Realizing that the person and environment framework, that systems theory, bullseye type graphic we talked about is really critical, and putting everything in the context of the stages of change. Where are you right now? And so these frameworks will help us approach the person in terms of building relationships, engaging them. And then as we reflect on the connection between thoughts and feelings and behaviors, using the MI techniques, we can really move forward from that. Next slide, please.
So now, thank you so much, Walter. What we're going to do is we're going to change that. We're going to go through the next steps and some take-home messages for you all, and then we'll conclude the whole presentation with question and answers. So if you have any questions or answers, any questions, please begin to think of them now, and then once we go through these next steps, we'll open up the chat room for your questions. So next steps, practice, practice, practice. So in the next few weeks, we want you to try to intentionally use at least one of the techniques that you heard today, so either open-ended questions, affirming, reflecting, or summarizing in your conversations. And we know that we've asked you not to interact with residents just yet, especially if you're a wellness nurse. So practice with your fellow resident wellness director, practice with family or friends. Just practice this technique of using either open-ended questions, affirming, reflecting, or summarizing. And then I know many of you all have started having conversations with your site liaison, so feel free to drop your site liaison an email or to call them to let them know how comfortable you feel using the OARS technique and how it's been going, trying it out and practicing.